What started as the happiest day of Sarah's life became her worst nightmare in seconds. After 8 years of struggling to get pregnant, she finally held her newborn daughter, Grace, in her arms. But when her millionaire husband, Richard, walked into that hospital room, everything changed forever. One slap. One moment of violence that would expose a web of lies, murder, and systematic abuse spanning years. You think you know how this story ends. You don't. Because the doctor who witnessed that attack was hiding a secret that would either save Sarah's life or destroy it completely. If this story grips you like it gripped millions of others, hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime that will leave you questioning everything. Drop a comment with your thoughts. I read every single one. Let's dive in. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across the delivery room as Sarah Mitchell gripped the bed rails, her knuckles white with pain. At 32 years old, after 8 years of failed fertility treatments, this was supposed to be her miracle moment. Instead, terror filled her chest as another contraction tore through her body. Push, Sarah, one more big push. Dr. James Blackstone called out from his position, his voice steady and professional. But Sarah barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the door, waiting for the man who should have been by her side hours ago. The delivery room door suddenly burst open with such force it slammed against the wall. Richard Mitchell strode in, his expensive tailored suit wrinkled, his face flushed with anger instead of the excitement Sarah had dreamed of seeing. His Rolex caught the harsh lights as he checked the time with obvious irritation. Finally decided to show up. Sarah managed through gritted teeth, trying to hide the hurt in her voice. Don't start with me, Sarah. Richard's voice carried that familiar edge of blame that always made Sarah's stomach clench. I was in the middle of closing the Peterson deal when you decided to go into labor. Couldn't you have waited until Monday? Dr. Blackstone looked up sharply from his position. Sir, your wife needs your support right now. She has been in labor for 16 hours. She needs to understand that some things are more important than her timing. Richard snapped, loosening his silk tie as if the very act of being in the delivery room was suffocating him. Sarah felt tears mixing with sweat on her cheeks. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. She had dreamed of this moment through countless failed treatments, 3 devastating miscarriages, and years of Richard's growing coldness. In her fantasies, he would hold her hand, whisper words of encouragement, maybe even cry with joy when their baby finally arrived. The baby is crowning, Dr. Blackstone announced, his voice filled with professional excitement. Sarah, give me everything you have got. Your daughter is almost here. Sarah bore down with all her strength, thinking of the tiny life about to enter the world. A life she had already loved fiercely for 9 months, talking to her belly every morning, playing classical music while she worked in her garden, dreaming of the family they would finally become. It's a girl. Dr. Blackstone lifted the crying infant, her tiny fist waving in the air. She is beautiful and healthy. Perfect 10 fingers and 10 toes. Sarah reached out her trembling arms, tears streaming down her face. My baby girl. My Grace. The name they had chosen together during one of their rare peaceful moments. Sitting in the nursery, they had painted soft yellow because they wanted to be surprised. But Richard's voice cut through her joy like a blade. A girl, we talked about this. Sarah, I need a son. Someone to carry on the Mitchell name and take over the business. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had carried this child for 9 months, endured morning sickness that lasted all day, swollen ankles, sleepless nights, and a complicated pregnancy that had kept her on bed rest for the final month. And his first words were disappointment. Richard, please, Sarah whispered, still reaching for their daughter. Just hold her. Look at how perfect she is. No. Richard's voice was ice cold. This is just another one of your failures. Sarah, first you cannot get pregnant naturally. Then you lose 3 babies. And now when you finally manage to carry one to term, it is not even what I asked for. Around them, the medical staff had gone silent, their faces shocked by the cruelty in Richard's words. Dr. Blackstone held baby Grace protectively, his dark eyes flashing with something Sarah could not quite identify. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Blackstone said firmly, stepping slightly between Richard and Sarah. Your daughter is perfect and healthy. Your wife just went through 16 hours of labor to bring this beautiful child into the world. Perhaps you might want to... Don't tell me about my wife, Richard snarled, his face reddening. And don't tell me about this disappointment. I specifically told Sarah I needed a male heir. Instead, she gives me another mouth to feed with no benefit to my legacy. Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest, not just her heart, but something deeper, some final thread of hope that had been holding their marriage together despite years of emotional abuse, financial control, and increasing isolation from everyone she had once cared about. That is what I think of your failures, Richard said quietly, his voice deadly calm. Then he did something that would haunt Sarah forever and change the course of 3 lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The slap echoed through the delivery room like a gunshot. Sarah's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning from the force of Richard's open palm. The heart monitor that had been tracking her vital signs suddenly began racing as her blood pressure spiked dangerously. That is what I think of you and your useless daughter, Richard said, flexing his fingers as if the slap had hurt his hand. Dr. Blackstone moved with surprising speed for a man in his late 50s, placing himself directly between Richard and Sarah while still holding the crying newborn. Security, I need security in delivery room 3 immediately. The 2 nurses in the room had gone pale with shock. One of them was already reaching for the emergency button on the wall, while the other moved to check Sarah's vital signs. Sarah touched her burning cheek with trembling fingers, her newborn daughter crying in Dr. Blackstone's protective arms. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not the family she had dreamed of building during those long, lonely nights when Richard worked late or traveled for business. Get out, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What did you say? Richard demanded, stepping closer despite Dr. Blackstone's protective stance. I said get out. Sarah's voice rose to a shout that seemed to surprise even her. Get out and don't come back. Get out and stay away from my daughter. Security guards appeared in the doorway within seconds, their hands already moving to their radios as they assessed the situation. The head of security, a woman named Captain Rodriguez, took one look at Sarah's reddening cheek and Richard's defensive posture and immediately understood what had happened. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us, Captain Rodriguez said in a voice that brooked no argument. This is my wife and my child, Richard protested, but his bluster was already fading as he realized how his actions looked to the room full of witnesses. Sir, you just committed assault in front of multiple medical professionals. You can leave voluntarily with us, or we can call the police, and you can leave in handcuffs. Your choice. As security escorted her millionaire husband from the room, Sarah did not know that Dr. Blackstone, the man now gently placing her daughter in her arms, would soon reveal a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, and her future. The door closed behind Richard with a soft click, and suddenly the room felt peaceful despite everything that had just happened. Dr. Blackstone adjusted baby Grace in Sarah's arms, his hands gentle and sure. "He is gone," Dr. Blackstone said softly. "And Sarah, I want you to know something. What just happened here, that was not about you or your beautiful daughter. That was about a small, cruel man who just revealed his true character to a room full of people who will never forget it." Sarah looked down at Grace's perfect face, her daughter's crying gradually subsiding as she settled against her mother's chest. Despite the burning in her cheek and the chaos in her heart, Sarah felt something unexpected relief. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, she did not have to apologize for existing. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in her private room on the maternity ward, little Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to a deep purple, and every time she touched it, she felt fresh waves of humiliation mixed with something she was slowly recognizing as liberation. The nursing staff had been extraordinarily kind, bringing her ice packs and gentle words of support. Captain Rodriguez had stopped by to let her know that hospital security footage had captured everything, and that charges could be filed if Sarah chose to pursue them. But mostly, Sarah just wanted to hold her daughter and figure out what came next. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly, careful not to wake Grace. Dr. Blackstone entered, but something about him seemed different. He had changed out of his scrubs into an expensive-looking charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. His posture seemed more formal, more commanding, and when he moved, there was an understated confidence that spoke of power and authority. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" His accent seemed less pronounced now, more refined, as if he had been unconsciously code-switching during the delivery. "Like my world just fell apart," she admitted, then quickly added, "Dr. Blackstone, I am so sorry about what happened in there. Richard is not usually—" She stopped herself, realizing that was a lie. Richard was exactly like that. She had just become an expert at hiding it. "Actually, he is usually like that, is not he?" Dr. Blackstone pulled up the visitor's chair beside her bed, sitting down with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Sarah, may I speak freely?" She nodded, adjusting Grace in her arms and wondering why this conversation felt different from the typical doctor-patient interactions she was used to. "I have been watching you for months through your prenatal visits. The way you flinch when your phone rings. The way you apologize for everything, even things that are not your fault. The way you try to explain away bruises that appear and disappear between appointments." Sarah's throat tightened. No one had ever called out the reality of her marriage so directly. "I don't know what you mean. Your husband hits you regularly, does not he? Today was not the first time." Dr. Blackstone's voice was gentle, but unwavering. "And I know something about abuse because I grew up watching it destroy my mother. I recognize the signs because I lived with them every day for the first 18 years of my life." The words hung in the air like an accusation Sarah could not deny. She looked down at Grace's perfect tiny face, unable to meet the doctor's eyes. "It's complicated," she whispered. "No, Sarah, it is not complicated. It is abuse." Dr. Blackstone leaned forward, his dark eyes intense but kind. "And what makes it worse is that you have been conditioned to believe you deserve it, that it is somehow your fault, that if you could just be better or stronger or more perfect, it would stop." Sarah felt tears starting again. This stranger was describing her life with an accuracy that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "You don't understand. Richard controls everything. The house, the money, the cars. I don't even have access to our bank accounts. If I leave, where would Grace and I go? How would we survive? How do you leave someone who controls everything? Your money, your friends, your sense of who you are. How do you start over when you do not even remember who you were before? Dr. Blackstone was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Sarah could not quite understand. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago, but I wanted to be absolutely certain. I needed time to process what I suspected and to figure out the right way to handle it. He paused, running his hand through his silver hair in a gesture that struck Sarah as somehow familiar. My name is not just Dr. James Blackstone, it is Dr. James Blackstone, founder and CEO of Blackstone Medical Technologies. The name hit Sarah like lightning. Everyone in America knew Blackstone Medical Technologies. They manufactured the cardiac devices that had revolutionized heart surgery, the diagnostic equipment in every major hospital, the prosthetics that had changed thousands of lives. She had read about James Blackstone in Forbes magazine just last month, a feature article about billionaire philanthropists who were quietly changing the world. That's impossible, she breathed, staring at this man who had just delivered her baby and was now claiming to be one of the richest people in America. 24 years ago, I was a young medical student working 3 jobs to pay my tuition. I met a woman named Linda Thompson at a coffee shop near the hospital. She was 19. I was 25. We fell in love almost instantly. Sarah's heart began to race for reasons she could not quite identify. Her mother's maiden name had been Thompson. Her adoptive mother had been 19 when Sarah was born. But her mother was dead, had died in a car accident when Sarah was 18. When Linda told me she was pregnant, I begged her to marry me. I was ready to drop out of medical school, get multiple jobs, do whatever it took to support our family. But her parents thought I was just some poor kid who was after their money. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. No, she whispered, but even as she said it, pieces were clicking into place. Her adoptive mother's mysterious past that she had never talked about. The way Linda had always changed the subject when Sarah asked about her biological father. The secret phone calls that stopped abruptly when Sarah entered the room. They paid her $5,000 to disappear, told her they would disown her if she ever contacted me again, and that they would make sure I never became a doctor if she did not cooperate. She took the money and vanished. Dr. Blackstone reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. I spent years trying to find her, but she had changed her name, gotten married to someone else. Linda Thompson became Linda Mitchell when she married your adoptive father. She told him you were his daughter. You were 3 years old at the time, just a little girl who needed a father figure. You're saying you're my... Sarah's voice failed her. I am your father. Sarah, I have been looking for you for 24 years. Grace stirred in Sarah's arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Dr. Blackstone looked at his granddaughter with tears in his eyes that he was trying hard to control. I knew the moment you walked into my office 6 months ago for your first prenatal appointment. You have your mother's eyes and her smile, but you have my hands and my stubborn chin. He held up his hands next to hers. The similarity was undeniable. The same long fingers, the same square palms, even the same small scar on the index finger from a childhood accident. Why didn't you say anything before? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I needed to be absolutely certain. I had DNA testing done on some routine blood work during your second visit. The results came back 3 months ago. Dr. Blackstone reached into his jacket again and pulled out another folded paper. Sarah Thompson Mitchell, you are my daughter, and this beautiful little girl is my granddaughter. Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her like an earthquake. Her whole life had been built on lies, but maybe for the first time in years, she was not alone. "What does this mean?" she asked, looking between the DNA test results and this man who was apparently her father. Dr. Blackstone reached into his jacket once more and pulled out a business card. But this was not a medical card. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that read James Blackstone, Chief Executive Officer, Blackstone Medical Technologies. "It means you never have to be afraid of Richard Mitchell again," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to wielding real power. "It means you have family who will protect you and Grace. And it means that the life you thought you were trapped in was just the prologue to the story you are really meant to live." Sarah stared at the business card, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. Her millionaire husband had just revealed himself to be an abusive monster, and the doctor who delivered her baby had just revealed himself to be her billionaire father. Grace made a contented sound in her sleep, and Sarah looked down at her daughter with wonder. This little girl would never know what it felt like to be powerless, to be trapped, to believe she deserved less than everything good the world had to offer. "James," Sarah said, testing the name on her tongue. "Dad, what happens now?" James smiled, and for the first time, Sarah could see her own smile reflected back at her. "Now, my dear daughter, we go home, and we start building the life you and Grace deserve." But outside the hospital, in the parking garage where he sat in his expensive car making phone calls, Richard Mitchell was not done fighting. He had built his tech empire by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else, and he was not about to let some billionaire steal his family just because he had more money. Richard opened his laptop and began researching everything he could find about James Blackstone. If this man wanted to play games with the Mitchell family, Richard would show him what happened when outsiders tried to interfere with a man's marriage and children. This was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The war for Sarah and Grace was about to escalate in ways none of them could imagine. And Richard Mitchell had weapons that even a billionaire might not be prepared for. Sarah had found her father and felt safe for the first time in years. She had no idea that her nightmare was about to get much, much worse before it got better. The next morning, Sarah sat in the passenger seat of James's private car, watching the city skyline emerge through the dawn mist. Grace slept peacefully in her car seat, completely unaware that her life had changed in ways that would affect her forever. They were heading to James's penthouse apartment in Manhattan, a temporary sanctuary, while they figured out their next steps. "How are you feeling about all this?" James asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror through his driver. His voice was gentle, but Sarah could hear the concern underneath. "Like I am living in someone else's life," Sarah admitted, adjusting Grace's blanket. 24 hours ago, I was trapped in an abusive marriage with no money, no family, no options. Now I am supposedly the daughter of a billionaire, and I still cannot quite believe it is real." The car pulled up to a gleaming glass tower on the Upper East Side. The doorman, apparently expecting them, hurried over to help with Sarah's bags. "Welcome home, Miss Blackstone," the doorman said with a warm smile that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Miss Blackstone. Sarah had never heard those words before, but they sent a strange thrill through her. Not Mrs. Mitchell. Not someone defined by her marriage to a man who treated her like property, but Miss Blackstone. A person in her own right, with her own identity and power. The penthouse elevator opened directly into the apartment, and Sarah stepped out with a gasp that made Grace stir in her arms. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, and the space was elegantly furnished, but felt warm and welcoming. Sarah. James appeared from what looked like a home office, his face lighting up at the sight of her and Grace. "How are my girls this beautiful morning?" "We are both fine," Sarah said, though she felt anything but fine. The events of the past day kept hitting her in waves. "James, this is all so overwhelming. Yesterday I did not even know you existed, and now I am discovering that my life can be completely different than what I thought possible. I know it is a lot to process, sweetheart, but I need you to understand something fundamental. You don't have to go back to him ever. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Sarah's phone, which had been mercifully quiet during the drive from the hospital, suddenly erupted with Richard's ringtone. She looked at the screen and felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. "Don't answer it," James said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from never having to raise it to be heard. "But if I don't, he will just get angrier. And when he gets angry—" "Sarah, look at me." James's voice was firm but gentle. "You are not responsible for managing his emotions anymore. You are not responsible for preventing his anger or minimizing his reactions. That is what abusers do. They train you to believe that their feelings are your responsibility, that their violence is something you provoke rather than something they choose." The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Sarah stared at the screen, watching Richard's name flash over and over, and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in 8 years, she did not feel the automatic compulsion to answer. But what she did not know was that Richard had been monitoring her phone calls for months through spy software he had installed. He had heard every word of her conversation with James in the hospital room. He knew about the DNA results, the billionaire father, the plans to leave him, and Richard Mitchell had spent the entire night preparing his counterattack. At exactly 9 a.m., as Sarah was beginning to feel safe in James's penthouse, a team of FBI agents was storming into Blackstone Medical Technologies headquarters with federal warrants. James's assistant called his personal cell phone, her voice tight with panic. "Mr. Blackstone, the FBI is here. They have warrants for your arrest on charges of kidnapping, custodial interference, and conspiracy to defraud." Sarah watched the color drain from James's face as he listened to the call. "What do you mean, kidnapping charges?" "Sir, they say you abducted Sarah Mitchell and her infant daughter using false pretenses and fabricated DNA evidence. They have recordings of you claiming to be her father and offering her money and housing to leave her husband." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. "That is impossible. The DNA test was real. You are my father." But even as she said it, doubt began creeping in. How did she really know she had only James's word, a piece of paper he had given her, and her own desperate need to believe she was not alone in the world? "Sir," James's assistant continued, "they also have a psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Mitchell claiming she is suffering from severe postpartum depression and is vulnerable to manipulation by predatory individuals." 20 minutes later, James was in handcuffs, being led away by federal agents while Sarah stood in the penthouse holding Grace, watching her newfound father disappear into an elevator. But the worst was yet to come. Another team of agents approached Sarah with documentation that made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, we have a court order for the immediate protective custody of the minor child Grace Mitchell, pending a full investigation into her welfare and your mental state." "You cannot take my baby," Sarah whispered, but even as she said it, she knew she had no power to stop them. "Ma'am, your husband has provided evidence that you have been exhibiting dangerous behavior, including abandoning the family home, associating with individuals of questionable character, and making delusional claims about your parentage. This is for the child's protection." As they took Grace from her arms, Sarah realized that Richard had not just been angry about her leaving. He had been planning this trap for months, maybe years. The spy software on her phone, the fabricated psychiatric records, the federal charges against James, all of it carefully orchestrated to isolate her completely and take away the only thing that mattered to her. Standing alone in James's penthouse, watching through the windows as federal agents drove away with her daughter, Sarah understood that her nightmare was not ending. It was just beginning. She had thought finding her father meant she was safe. Instead, it had given Richard the perfect weapon to destroy them both. Sarah sat alone in the penthouse, staring at her silent phone and trying to piece together what had just happened. Grace was gone, taken by Child Protective Services. James was in federal custody, charged with kidnapping and fraud, and somewhere in the city, Richard was probably celebrating his victory. But something did not add up. The timing was too perfect. Richard's response too quick and sophisticated. How had he managed to fabricate federal charges and psychiatric evaluations in less than 24 hours? Her phone finally rang, but it was not Richard's number. It was a call from someone named Marcus Webb, who identified himself as Richard's attorney. Mrs. Mitchell, I am calling to inform you that your husband is prepared to drop all federal charges against Dr. Blackston and allow you to retain custody of Grace under certain conditions. What conditions? Sarah asked, though she already knew she would hate the answer. You return home immediately, agree to undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment, and discontinue all contact with James Blackstone and anyone associated with him. You also sign a statement admitting that your claims about Blackstone being your father were delusional episodes brought on by postpartum depression. Sarah felt sick. And if I refuse, then the federal charges proceed. Grace remains in protective custody indefinitely, and you face your own charges for child endangerment and conspiracy. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband has documentation going back months showing your declining mental state, your bizarre behavior, your increasing paranoia. No court will award custody to a woman with your psychiatric history. After Marcus hung up, Sarah sat in the empty penthouse trying to figure out what to do. She needed to know the truth about James, about the DNA test, about everything. But how could she find out when everyone with answers was either in custody or working for Richard? Then she remembered something. Nurse Diana Rodriguez from the hospital had given Sarah her personal card and told her to call if she ever needed anything. Diana had witnessed Richard's violence, had helped Sarah in those first moments. Maybe she would have answers. Diana agreed to meet Sarah at a coffee shop near the hospital, and what she told Sarah changed everything. I have been a nurse for 20 years, Diana said quietly, looking around to make sure they were not being overheard. I have seen domestic violence cases before, but what happened to you was different. Your husband did not just snap in the moment. He came to the hospital prepared. What do you mean? He had paperwork with him, Sarah, legal documents, psychiatric evaluations, even a court order for DNA testing. He knew exactly what to do when you tried to leave him. This was not a crime of passion. This was a carefully planned operation. Sarah felt her blood run cold. How is that possible? Because James Blackstone is not your father. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. What? I ran my own check after you left the hospital. James Blackstone never had children. He was married for 30 years to a woman named Catherine, but they were unable to have kids. It was well documented because they donated millions to fertility research. Sarah stared at Diana, unable to process what she was hearing. But the DNA test was fake. Richard hired James to play this role. Sarah, he paid him to pretend to be your father, to offer you a way out, knowing that you would take it. Then he used your delusional belief that you had found your billionaire father as grounds to have you committed and take custody of Grace. The coffee shop seemed to tilt around Sarah as the full scope of Richard's manipulation became clear. Her husband had not just been controlling her for 8 years. He had been orchestrating an elaborate psychological trap designed to destroy her completely. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he go to such lengths?" Diana hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a news article. "Because of this?" The headline read, "Tech Billionaire. Richard Mitchell announces major acquisition." But it was not about his business. It was about his personal life. Richard Mitchell, founder and CEO of Mitchell Technologies, announced today his engagement to business partner Victoria Sterling, following his wife's tragic mental breakdown and subsequent hospitalization. The couple expects their first child together in 6 months. Sarah stared at the article, trying to process the timeline. Victoria Sterling was already 6 months pregnant. Richard had been planning to leave Sarah for his pregnant mistress, but he needed to make Sarah look like the unstable one who abandoned the marriage. "He needed you to look crazy," Diana explained. "He needed documentation that you were delusional, that you abandoned your family, that you were unfit to be a mother. Then he could divorce you, keep Grace, and marry Victoria without looking like the villain." But James seemed so real, so genuine. How could he fake something like that? "Because he is not really James Blackstone either. I did some digging. His real name is Michael Torres, and he is an actor Richard hired from Los Angeles. A good one, apparently. He has been playing this role for months, preparing for the moment when you finally tried to leave." Sarah felt the last of her hope crumble. There was no billionaire father coming to save her. There was no family fortune, no protection, no way out. Richard had created an elaborate fantasy designed to trap her in an even worse nightmare. "What do I do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Diana reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Now you fight back, but not the way Richard expects. He thinks he has won, thinks you are completely broken and defeated. That gives us an advantage." "Us?" "Sarah, I have been documenting domestic violence cases for years, working with an organization that helps women escape abusive situations. We have resources Richard does not know about, lawyers he has never heard of, safe houses that do not exist on any official records." For the first time since Grace was taken, Sarah felt a spark of hope. But it was a different kind of hope than before. Not the hope that someone would rescue her, but the hope that maybe she could rescue herself. "What do I need to do?" Diana smiled grimly. "First, we make Richard think he has won completely. Then, we destroy him the way he tried to destroy you. But Sarah, you need to understand what comes next is going to be the hardest thing you have ever done. Are you ready for that?" Sarah thought about Grace, somewhere in the city without her mother, probably scared and confused. She thought about Richard and Victoria, planning their perfect life built on Sarah's destruction. She thought about all the other women who might be going through the same thing, trapped by men who use the system itself as a weapon. "I am ready," she said. And for the first time in 8 years, she meant it completely. Diana led Sarah through a maze of city streets to an unmarked building in Queens. They took 2 different subway lines and switched trains 3 times, Diana constantly checking to make sure they were not being followed. "Richard has been tracking your movements for months," Diana explained as they walked up 3 flights of stairs to an apartment with no name on the door. "Phone GPS, credit cards, even the car. He knows everywhere you go. But he does not know about this place." The apartment looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it was clearly a command center, multiple computer screens, filing cabinets filled with legal documents, and a dozen phones charging on a table. 3 women were working at computers, and they looked up when Diana and Sarah entered. "This is Sarah," Diana announced. "Richard Mitchell case." The women's expressions immediately became serious. One of them, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair, stood up and extended her hand. "I am Detective Lisa Chen, retired NYPD. I specialize in domestic violence cases that involve wealthy perpetrators who use the legal system as a weapon." She gestured for Sarah to sit down. "We have been monitoring your husband's activities for the past 6 months. Monitoring him how? Because you are not his first victim. Sarah, Richard Mitchell has a pattern. This is the 3rd time he has done exactly this same thing." Lisa pulled out a thick file and spread photographs across the table. Sarah found herself looking at pictures of 2 other women, both around her age, both with the same haunted expression she recognized from her own mirror. Jennifer Walsh, his first wife, married him in 2006 when he was just starting his company. When she tried to leave him in 2010, he had her committed to a psychiatric facility, took custody of their son, and had her declared legally incompetent. She spent 2 years fighting to prove her sanity and never got her child back. Sarah stared at the photograph of Jennifer, seeing herself in the woman's desperate eyes. Rebecca Torres, his second wife, same pattern. 4 years later, he even used the same fake father scheme with her, convinced her that a wealthy businessman was her long-lost relative. When she tried to leave with their daughter, he used her delusions to get full custody. Rebecca never recovered from losing her child. She committed suicide 2 years ago. The room went silent as Sarah processed this information. She was not just fighting for her own life and Grace's future. She was part of a pattern of systematic destruction that Richard had perfected over years. "Why has no one stopped him?" Sarah asked. "Because he is very good at what he does," Lisa replied. "Rich, connected, and smart enough to make every move look legal and reasonable. He probably has judges, psychiatrists, and social workers on his payroll. The system is designed to protect men like Richard, especially when they are fighting women with no resources or credibility." Another woman at the computers, younger with red hair, turned to join the conversation. "I am Amanda Foster, and I am a forensic computer expert. I have been tracking Richard's digital footprint, and Sarah, what we have found is going to help us destroy him." Amanda pulled up screens full of data that meant nothing to Sarah but clearly excited the other women in the room. "Richard has been planning this for over a year. We have evidence of payments to Michael Torres, the actor who played your fake father. We have records of bribes to hospital staff, falsified psychiatric reports, even documentation showing he has been slowly poisoning you with anxiety medication to make you appear unstable." Sarah felt the room spinning. "Poisoning me. Small doses of benzodiazepines in your food, probably in your coffee or tea, just enough to make you seem anxious, forgetful, emotionally unstable. Classic gaslighting technique, but with chemical assistance." Diana reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Sarah, we have enough evidence to send Richard to prison for 20 years, but we need to be very careful about how we use it. He still has Grace, and if he realizes we are onto him, he might disappear with her." Lisa spread out what looked like a battle plan across the table. "Here is what we are going to do. First, Sarah, you are going to go home and pretend to surrender completely. Apologize to Richard, agree to psychiatric treatment, play the role of the broken wife who accepts his version of reality." "I cannot do that," Sarah said immediately. "I cannot go back to him after everything he has done." "You can and you will," Lisa said firmly, "because it is the only way to save Grace. While you are playing the perfect victim, we are going to be building a case that will destroy him publicly and legally." Amanda turned her computer screen toward Sarah. Look at this. Richard has been embezzling money from his own company to pay for his operations against you and his previous wives. His business partner, Victoria Sterling, is in on it. They have been stealing from investors, falsifying contracts, even using company resources to pay for private investigators and legal fees. We are going to expose all of it, Diana added, but we need time to do it right. And we need Richard to think he has won completely, so he gets careless and makes mistakes. Lisa pulled out a small device that looked like a pen. This is a recording device, military grade, undetectable by normal security sweeps. You are going to wear it every time you interact with Richard, Victoria, or any of his associates. We need him to confess to what he has done, preferably in detail. Sarah looked around the room at these women who were risking everything to help her. Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me when you do not even know me? Lisa's expression softened. Because I was Jennifer Walsh's detective on the original case. I watched Richard destroy her, and I was powerless to stop it because I did not have enough evidence. I have been waiting 8 years for another chance to bring him down. Diana nodded. And because every woman who escapes from someone like Richard makes it easier for the next one. We are not just fighting for you and Grace. We are fighting for all the women who come after. Amanda looked up from her computers. And because men like Richard think they are untouchable, they think money and power make them immune to consequences. I specialize in proving them wrong. Sarah felt something she had not experienced in years, the knowledge that she was not alone. These women understood exactly what Richard had done to her because they had seen it before. They had resources, skills, and most importantly, they had a plan. What do I need to do? Sarah asked. Go home. Lisa said, play the perfect victim and help us gather the evidence we need to make sure Richard Mitchell never hurts another woman again. As Sarah prepared to return to the house that had been her prison for 8 years, she carried with her something more powerful than hope. She carried the knowledge that she was part of something bigger than herself, a network of women who refused to let men like Richard win. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and this time, Sarah would not be fighting alone. Sarah stood outside the house she had once called home, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle. Everything looked exactly the same as when she had left 2 days ago, but she felt like a completely different person. The recording device was hidden in her jacket pocket, and Diana's words echoed in her mind, "Make him think he has won completely." Richard was waiting for her in the living room, sitting in his leather chair like a king on his throne. Victoria Sterling was beside him on the couch, her pregnant belly visible even through her designer dress. The sight of them together, so comfortable and confident, made Sarah's stomach clench with rage. But she forced herself to remember Grace, somewhere in the city without her mother, and played the role these people expected to see. "Richard," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry. You were right about everything." Richard's eyebrows raised slightly, clearly surprised by her submissive tone. "Are you, Sarah, because your behavior over the past 2 days suggests otherwise. I know. I was confused, scared. That man, the one who claimed to be my father. He took advantage of me when I was vulnerable after giving birth. I see that now." Sarah forced tears into her eyes, drawing on 8 years of genuine pain and fear. "I just want to come home. I just want my family back." Victoria shifted uncomfortably on the couch, clearly not expecting this version of Sarah. She had probably been prepared for a fight, for drama, for the angry confrontation that would justify whatever they had planned next. And what about Grace? Richard asked, his voice carefully neutral. I understand why you had to take her away from me. I was not in my right mind. I put her in danger by trusting that stranger. Sarah moved closer, keeping her voice small and broken. I will do whatever you think is best. Therapy, medication, whatever it takes to prove I can be a good mother again. Richard studied her face carefully, looking for signs of deception. Sarah had learned over years of marriage how to hide her true feelings from him, how to show him only what he wanted to see. Now that skill might save her life. Victoria and I have been discussing the situation, Richard said finally. We think it would be best for everyone if you took some time to focus on your mental health. There is a very good facility in Vermont that specializes in postpartum depression and related disorders. Sarah felt her blood run cold, but she kept her expression grateful and relieved. That sounds wonderful, Richard. I trust your judgment completely. What he was really saying was that he planned to have her institutionalized, probably permanently, just like he had done to Jennifer Walsh and Rebecca Torres. But this time, Sarah was recording every word. How long would I be there? She asked, making sure her voice carried just the right mix of hope and anxiety. As long as it takes, Victoria said, speaking for the first time. Her voice carried a smugness that made Sarah want to scream. We just want what's best for you and the baby. The baby. Not Grace. Not your daughter. Just the baby, as if Grace was already no longer Sarah's child. Of course, Sarah said. When would I go? Tomorrow morning, Richard replied. I have already made the arrangements. Victoria will help you pack tonight. Sarah nodded gratefully, all while thinking about the evidence Amanda and Lisa were gathering. Every conversation, every detail about Richard's plan, every casual admission of what he had done was being recorded and documented. That evening, as Victoria supervised Sarah's packing with obvious satisfaction, Sarah played her role perfectly. She asked about Grace with the right amount of worry, but not too much insistence. She expressed gratitude for Richard's patience and understanding. She even apologized to Victoria for any awkwardness her episode might have caused. I hope you know I never meant to come between you and Richard, Sarah said as she folded clothes into a suitcase. I can see how happy you make him, and I want him to be happy. Victoria's expression softened slightly. It has been difficult for all of us. Sarah, Richard was so worried about you, especially after losing the other babies. He just wants you to get better. The other babies, Sarah asked carefully. The miscarriages. He told me how hard those were on you, how they might have contributed to your current mental state. Sarah nodded sadly, but inside she was furious. Richard had told Victoria about the miscarriages, had used Sarah's most private pain as justification for his actions. But Victoria's casual mention of them also revealed something important. She knew details about Sarah's medical history that she should not have known unless Richard had been sharing private information for months, maybe years. Later that night, when Richard thought Sarah was asleep, she heard him on the phone in his office. The recording device picked up every word. No, she is completely broken now, totally compliant. The facility in Vermont will keep her as long as we need them to. A pause. Yes, the divorce papers are already prepared. Once she is declared incompetent, I get full custody of Grace and complete control of all marital assets. Another pause. Victoria's pregnancy is progressing normally. We can be married as soon as the divorce is finalized. A longer pause. Then Richard's voice again, quieter, but more menacing. What about the other loose ends? Jennifer Walsh's son has been asking questions about his mother's death. We need to make sure he does not become a problem. Sarah's blood went cold. Jennifer Walsh had not just lost custody of her son. According to Lisa, she had died in the psychiatric facility. But Richard was talking about her death as if it was something he had arranged. And Rebecca Torres killed herself. But her sister has been making noise about wanting an investigation. Can we handle that? Sarah realized she was listening to Richard discuss the systematic destruction of his previous wives as if he was planning a business merger. Casual, practical, completely devoid of human emotion. The recording device captured every word. The next morning, as Sarah prepared to leave for the psychiatric facility that would probably be her prison for years, she felt something she had not experienced in her entire marriage to Richard: genuine confidence. Because while Richard thought he was sending her away to be forgotten and destroyed, Sarah was actually being extracted by an underground network of women who had been planning his downfall for years. The war was about to enter its final phase, and Richard Mitchell had no idea that his perfect victim was about to become his worst nightmare. The Willowbrook Treatment Center looked exactly like what it was, a place where wealthy families sent inconvenient relatives to disappear. Set on 50 acres of Vermont countryside, it resembled a luxury resort more than a psychiatric hospital, but Sarah could see the bars on the windows and the guards at every entrance. Richard accompanied her for the admission process, playing the role of the concerned husband perfectly. He held her hand, spoke in gentle tones about wanting her to get better, and assured the staff that money was no object when it came to Sarah's care. "My wife has been through so much," he told Dr. Williams, the facility director. "The fertility struggles, the miscarriages, and now this postpartum episode where she became convinced that a stranger was her father. I just want her to have the best possible care." Dr. Williams nodded sympathetically. "We specialize in cases like this, Mr. Mitchell, women who experience trauma-induced delusions, particularly those involving family relationships. With the right medication and therapy, we can help Sarah accept reality and move forward." Sarah sat quietly, playing her role, but she was recording every word. The casual way they discussed her case, the assumptions about her mental state, the complete dismissal of her own perspective, all of it was evidence of how the system could be weaponized against vulnerable women. After Richard left, promising to visit soon, Sarah was escorted to her room by a nurse named Patricia. The room was comfortable, but clearly designed to prevent self-harm or escape. The windows did not open. There were no sharp objects, and the door could only be unlocked from the outside. "You will like it here, dear," Patricia said with professional kindness. "Most of our patients find the routine very soothing: breakfast at 7, therapy at 9, group sessions in the afternoon, dinner at 6. Very structured, very safe." That first week, Sarah played the perfect patient. She attended every therapy session, took the medications they prescribed, and gradually began to accept the reality that her belief about finding her father had been a delusion brought on by postpartum depression. But what the staff did not know was that Sarah had 3 allies on the outside who were working tirelessly to document Richard's crimes. Deanna had taken a job as a temporary nurse at Willowbrook, using false credentials that Amanda had created. Lisa was investigating the suspicious deaths of Richard's previous wives, following paper trails that led to offshore accounts and falsified medical records. And Amanda was tracking Richard's digital communications, watching as he made increasingly careless mistakes. The breakthrough came during Sarah's second week at the facility, when Diana managed to access Sarah's medical files during a late-night shift. "Sarah," Diana whispered during what appeared to be a routine medication check, "you need to see this." She showed Sarah a document that made her blood run cold. It was a treatment plan that called for increasing doses of antipsychotic medications, electroshock therapy, and eventually a procedure called a therapeutic lobotomy that would leave Sarah permanently brain damaged but compliant. Richard paid them $200,000 to make sure you never leave here. Diana explained, "This is not a treatment plan. It is a slow-motion execution." But they also had good news. Lisa had found evidence linking Richard to the deaths of both Jennifer Walsh and Rebecca Torres. Jennifer had not died of natural causes in the psychiatric facility. She had been given a lethal dose of insulin by staff members who were paid to make her death look like suicide. Rebecca had not killed herself. She had been murdered and her death staged to look self-inflicted. Richard Mitchell was not just an abuser. He was a serial killer who had been using the mental health system to murder his wives. "We have enough evidence to bring him down," Diana reported. "But we need to move fast. Lisa thinks he is already planning to have Victoria eliminated after their baby is born. He does not want to share custody or inheritance with anyone." That night, as Sarah lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the institutional night shift, she made a decision that would change everything. She was done playing the victim, done waiting for the system to protect her, done hoping that someone else would save her. She was going to save herself, using a method Diana had taught her. Sarah induced vomiting after taking her evening medications, then hid the pills in her pillowcase. Within 3 days, her mind was clear for the first time in months. The anxiety and confusion that had plagued her were lifting, and she realized that Richard had been drugging her long before she entered the facility. Diana smuggled in a cell phone during one of her shifts, and Sarah used it to contact Amanda directly. "Amanda, it is Sarah. I need you to do something for me." "Sarah, are you okay? We have been working on getting you out of there, but it is complicated. I need you to hack into Richard's phone and send a message to Victoria. Make it look like it is coming from him." Sarah outlined her plan, and Amanda was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, that is incredibly dangerous. If Richard realizes what we are doing before we can get you out of there, he is going to kill me anyway." Sarah said simply, "Either slowly with drugs and procedures, or quickly if he gets impatient. At least this way, I go down fighting." The next morning, Victoria Sterling received a text message that appeared to come from Richard. "Meet me at the warehouse tonight at 10 p.m. We need to discuss the Sarah situation privately." What Victoria did not know was that Lisa Chen and a team of federal investigators would be waiting for her, along with recording equipment that would capture her confession to multiple murders. Sarah's nightmare was finally coming to an end, but not because someone had rescued her. It was ending because she had learned to rescue herself, with the help of women who understood that sometimes the only way to defeat a system designed to destroy you is to turn that system against itself. The final battle was about to begin, and this time, Sarah Mitchell was not going to be the victim. She was going to be the hunter. Victoria Sterling arrived at the warehouse 15 minutes early, her designer heels clicking against the concrete floor as she searched for Richard in the shadows. What she found instead were Detective Lisa Chen and 3 FBI agents, with recording equipment that had captured everything she said during the past month of phone conversations with Richard. "Victoria Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and accessory to the deaths of Jennifer Walsh and Rebecca Torres." 20 miles away, at the same moment Victoria was being arrested, federal agents were surrounding Richard's house with warrants for his arrest on charges of serial murder, kidnapping, fraud, and racketeering. But Richard was not there. He was at Willowbrook Treatment Center, standing in Sarah's room with a syringe filled with a lethal dose of insulin, the same method he had used to kill Jennifer Walsh 4 years earlier. "I really hoped it would not come to this," Richard said conversationally, as if they were discussing dinner plans instead of murder. "The facility was supposed to handle this more slowly, more naturally, but you had to start causing problems. didn't you?" Sarah sat on her bed, hands folded in her lap, looking for all the world like the perfect victim Richard expected. But hidden in her palm was the panic button Diana had given her, connected directly to Lisa Chen's phone. "I don't understand. Richard, I have been taking my medication, going to therapy. Dr. Williams says I am making progress." "Dr. Williams is an idiot," Richard replied, moving closer with the syringe. "And you are not nearly as broken as you pretend to be. I can see it in your eyes. Sarah, you are planning something." "I am not planning anything. I just want to get better and come home to you and Grace." Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "There is no coming home. Sarah, there never was. Just like there was no coming home for Jennifer or Rebecca. You were all just temporary solutions to business problems. Business problems. I needed wives who could provide me with children, social connections, and credibility. But I never intended to keep any of you permanently. Divorce is messy and expensive. This way is much cleaner." Sarah pressed the panic button, knowing that Lisa and the FBI team would be racing toward Willowbrook within minutes. But she also knew that Richard could kill her long before they arrived. "What about Grace? What about our daughter? Grace will grow up believing her mother died tragically of mental illness, just like Jennifer's son and Rebecca's daughter believe about their mothers. Victoria and I will raise her, and she will never know the truth." Richard moved closer, raising the syringe. "This will only hurt for a moment. Sarah, then all your problems will be over." But Sarah was no longer the terrified, isolated woman who had been slapped in a delivery room 2 weeks earlier. She was a woman who had discovered her own strength, supported by other women who refused to let her fight alone. "You made one mistake, Richard." "What mistake is that?" "You told me everything, and I recorded every word." Sarah pulled out the hidden recording device she had been carrying for days, the device that had captured Richard's confession to 3 murders and his detailed plans for killing her and Victoria. Richard's face went white as he realized what she had done. "You little—" The door burst open as Diana Rodriguez, Lisa Chen, and 4 FBI agents stormed into the room. Richard spun toward them with the syringe, but Lisa was faster, her weapon drawn and pointed at his chest. "Drop it, Richard. It is over." For a moment, Richard stood frozen, the syringe in his hand, his perfect plan crumbling around him. Then his shoulders sagged in defeat, and he let the weapon fall to the floor. "Richard Mitchell, you are under arrest for the murders of Jennifer Walsh and Rebecca Torres, and the attempted murder of Sarah Mitchell. You have the right to remain silent." As Lisa read Richard his rights, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in 8 years of marriage: complete and total freedom. Not just freedom from Richard, but freedom from fear, from the belief that she was powerless, from the idea that her life was controlled by forces beyond her influence. Diana helped her gather her belongings, which consisted of almost nothing since everything at Willowbrook belonged to the facility. But Sarah did not care about possessions anymore. She cared about something far more valuable: her daughter. "Where is Grace?" Sarah asked Lisa as they walked out of Willowbrook together. "Safe. We found her with a foster family that Richard had paid to keep her temporarily. She has been well cared for, and she is asking for her mama." 3 hours later, Sarah held her daughter for the first time in 2 weeks. Feeling Grace's tiny hands grip her finger with surprising strength, they were in Lisa's car, driving back to New York, leaving the nightmare of Willowbrook behind forever. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we make sure Richard never hurts anyone again." Lisa replied, "His trial will be front-page news, and every detail of what he did to you, Jennifer and Rebecca will be public record. Other women who are going through similar situations will see that it is possible to fight back and win. Amanda, who was sitting in the passenger seat monitoring police communications on her laptop, turned to smile at Sarah. And now we help other women do exactly what you did. The network we built to save you is going to save dozens of others. Diana reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. You did something incredible. Sarah, you saved yourself. And in doing so, you probably saved Victoria's life and countless other women who would have been Richard's future victims. As they drove through the night toward New York City, Sarah looked down at Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms and realized that her story was not ending. It was beginning. She had survived domestic abuse, systematic gaslighting, attempted murder, and institutional betrayal. But more than that, she had learned that she was not alone, that there were other women fighting the same battles, and that together they were stronger than any individual predator. The scared woman who had been slapped in a hospital delivery room was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her own power and was ready to use it to protect others. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the New York State Senate Judiciary Committee, holding Grace on her hip as she prepared to testify in support of the Jennifer Walsh Protection Act. Legislation designed to prevent domestic abusers from using the mental health system as a weapon against their victims. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she began, her voice clear and strong. And I am here to tell you about a system that nearly killed me and did kill 2 other women whose only crime was trying to escape abusive marriages. In the gallery behind her sat Diana Rodriguez, Lisa Chen, and Amanda Foster, the women who had saved her life by teaching her to save herself. Also present were Jennifer Walsh's son, now 18 and determined to honor his mother's memory, and Rebecca Torres's sister, who had fought for years to get someone to investigate her sister's suspicious death. Richard Mitchell was serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Victoria Sterling had received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony against Richard, revealing the full scope of his crimes and the network of corrupt officials who had enabled him. The trial had been a media sensation, exposing not just Richard's crimes, but the systematic ways that wealthy abusers could manipulate legal, medical, and social service systems to destroy their victims. The story had gone viral, not as entertainment, but as education, showing other women that escape was possible and help was available. The Jennifer Walsh Protection Act will require independent oversight of psychiatric commitments involving domestic violence cases. Sarah continued her testimony. It will mandate that no woman can be involuntarily committed based solely on her husband's claims, without independent evaluation by professionals who have no financial relationship to the accuser. Grace babbled softly during Sarah's testimony, drawing smiles from the usually stern senators. At 8 months old, she was a healthy, happy baby who would grow up knowing that her mother was a woman who fought monsters and won. After the hearing, Sarah met with reporters who wanted to know what her plans were for the future. The question everyone was asking was whether she would write a book about her experience, whether she would become a full-time advocate, whether she would run for office herself. My immediate plan is to be the best mother I can be to Grace, Sarah said, smiling as her daughter reached for the microphones with curiosity rather than fear. But I also plan to continue working with the network that saved my life, helping other women who are going through what I went through. Lisa Chen had offered Sarah a job with her expanding organization, which now had federal funding to create safe houses and support networks in 12 states. Deanna had returned to nursing, but volunteered her time training medical professionals to recognize signs of systematic abuse. Amanda had started a nonprofit that specialized in helping abuse victims disappear from their abusers' digital tracking systems. Together, they had created something unprecedented, a network specifically designed to fight wealthy, connected abusers who used their resources to manipulate the system itself. In 6 months, they had helped 17 women escape situations similar to Sarah's, and they were training other teams in cities across the country. But perhaps the most important change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had once apologized for existing now spoke with authority about domestic violence policy. The woman who had been terrified to order coffee without permission now addressed Senate committees and federal investigators with confidence. She had discovered something that Richard had tried to destroy: her own voice, her own power, her own worth. That evening, as Sarah put Grace to bed in their small apartment near the organization's headquarters, she reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. She was not wealthy, Richard's assets were tied up in legal proceedings, and she would probably never recover the millions he had stolen from their marital accounts. But she was free, and she was no longer alone. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a woman in Chicago whose husband had started exhibiting the same patterns Sarah recognized from her own experience. "I read about your story online. I think my husband is planning something. Can you help?" Sarah looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her crib, then at the phone in her hand. This was her life now, helping other women find the strength to save themselves, just as she had been helped to find her own strength. "Yes," she typed back. "We can help. You are not alone." Outside her window, New York City hummed with life. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their futures, choosing their own paths. Sarah was no longer a prisoner in someone else's story. She was the author of her own life, and she was writing chapters filled with purpose, community, and hope. The millionaire who had slapped her in a hospital delivery room was gone from her life forever. The doctor who had pretended to be her billionaire father was just a memory of how desperate she had been for rescue. But the women who had taught her to rescue herself, they were family now. Chosen family built on shared strength and mutual protection. Grace stirred in her sleep, and Sarah gently stroked her daughter's hair. "You are going to grow up knowing you are powerful, little girl," she whispered. "You are going to grow up knowing that no one has the right to control you, hurt you, or make you feel small. And you are going to grow up knowing that there are women who will fight for each other, no matter what." In the quiet of the apartment, surrounded by the sounds of a city full of people living their own stories, Sarah Mitchell felt something she had never experienced before: complete contentment with her own life, exactly as it was. The scared woman who had been trapped in an abusive marriage was gone. The confident woman who helped other trapped women escape had taken her place. And that woman was going to spend the rest of her life making sure that no other Grace would ever have to wonder why her father hit her mother in a hospital delivery room. The story that had begun with violence and terror had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of women who refuse to let each other fight alone, and the unbreakable strength that emerges when someone finally discovers their own worth. Sarah turned off the lights and settled into her chair by Grace's crib, listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing and planning tomorrow's work of helping another woman find her way to freedom. The future had never looked brighter.